Welcome back for another deep dive. This time we're going to be looking at the lives of three kings of Israel, Saul, David, and Solomon. You sent over these excerpts from a couple of religious texts, and they really go into depth about these guys. I gotta say, I'm pretty excited to dive into, what made each of these leaders tick, you know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. Their reigns, weren't just about politics and power. They were, super tied into Israel's covenant with God. So everything they did had a big impact on the nation.
Exactly. It wasn't just about like military strength or who had the biggest palace, right? Their relationship with their faith, it really played a huge role. But before we really get into their stories, we kind of need to go back a bit, back to the time before there even was a king in Israel, back to the time of the judges.
Oh yeah, that was a wild time. It was kind of a cycle: sin, oppression, repentance, deliverance, and then start all over again.
So, I imagine they were just desperate for some stability. It makes sense that they would start wanting a king. But, I've always kind of wondered about those instructions that God gave about kingship in Deuteronomy 17. It almost seems like he was, setting them up to fail, by saying they couldn't have a bunch of wealth or horses or even like multiple wives. That just seems like, King 101 stuff.
It is really interesting, isn't it? It's almost like those rules were meant to, make sure the king would have to rely on God, not just on like worldly power. Because if they had all that wealth and all those alliances, it could distract them.
Yeah.
From their real purpose.
Yeah.
Leading the people the way God wanted.
Yeah. Almost like a test, right? To see if they could resist those temptations and stay focused on what was really important, Speaking of tests, how did our first king, Saul, how would he do?
Well, he certainly looked the part. He was, taller than everyone else, came from a good family, and he even seemed humble at first.
Okay, so outward appearances were in his favor. And he won some big battles early on, right?
Yeah, he did. Unified the nation and fought off some pretty tough enemies, like the Ammonites and the Philistines.
Yeah.
For a while there, he seemed like exactly what they needed.
But it seems like everything was going so well for him. What happened? Where did things start going south?
There were a few moments that I guess you could say marked his downfall. The first was when he offered a sacrifice himself instead of waiting for the prophet Samuel. Like God had commanded. It was kind of like he was trying to, take over the religious authority too.
Yeah.
Putting his will ahead of God's.
Yeah. Now, the Amalekites those guys were pretty brutal, right? What was it about them that might have tempted Saul to disobey God when it came to wiping them out?
Oh, the Amalekites. They were nomads, and they've been Israel's enemies for generations. God had specifically told Saul to utterly destroy them, like everyone and everything. But Saul, he didn't. He kept their king alive, and he took the best livestock for himself.
So basically greed and desire for spoils of war got the better of him.
Yeah, that's certainly possible. And it was definitely a big no-no. Going against God's orders like that, well, it had serious consequences.
Yeah.
Samuel, speaking on God's behalf, he told Saul that, he was basically fired, rejected as king.
Yeah. That's a pretty rough fall from grace. But it didn't stop there, did it? It sounds like things just got worse.
Oh, they did. He got more and more paranoid, suspicious. He ended up ordering the massacre of a whole bunch of priests at Nob, just based on like totally unfounded accusations. He became heartless, just consumed by his own ego and insecurities. In the end, he put himself above everyone else, including God.
And his end was just tragic. He consulted a medium, which was forbidden, and then lost a major battle against the Philistines. And finally, facing defeat, he actually took his own life. What a contrast to those early days when he seemed like such a promising leader. It really just shows you how destructive, pride and disobedience can be.
Definitely. It's a powerful reminder that real leadership, it has to be rooted in humility and obedience and a deep reverence for something bigger than yourself.
All right, so Saul's reign ends in tragedy, but his successor, David, he's often called a man after God's own heart, but what does that even mean? What made him so different from Saul?
That's a great question. It goes way deeper than just following the rules. David's life really gets into, what it means to have a heart that's in tune with God's.
All right, I am ready to get into that. From what I remember, it's quite the story. Yeah, Davy's story is it's just so captivating, full of adventure, faith, and those very human flaws. It's what makes him so relatable. I'm I'm definitely interested to hear more about how he became this man after God's own heart. What was he like before he was king?
Well, you know, before he was king, he was just a shepherd, taking care of his father's flocks out in the fields of Bethlehem. But even then, you could see glimpses of his courage and talent.
Yeah.
You know, he protected those sheep from lions and bears, and he was also a musician and poet. A lot of the songs we read, they're probably from that time in his life.
So he definitely wasn't born into royalty, that's for sure. How did this shepherd boy end up becoming king anyway?
It's a great example of how God looks beyond appearances. When Saul was rejected as king, God sent the prophet Samuel to find a replacement, you know, from among Jesse's sons. And Samuel, he was immediately drawn to Eliab, the oldest. He was tall and handsome, just like Saul.
Yeah, I mean, people have always kind of had a thing for charismatic leaders, right?
It's a timeless pattern, isn't it? But God, he told Samuel, look, you got to look beyond appearances. Man looks at the outward appearance, he said, but the Lord looks at the heart. He wasn't looking for a king who just looked the part. He wanted someone with a heart of faithfulness and humility.
And that's where David comes in, the youngest son, the one everyone kind of overlooked. The classic underdog story, right?
Totally. And that contrast with Saul it's really important. Saul was chosen for what he looked like on the outside, but David, he was chosen for who he was on the inside.
Yeah, but David wasn't just some quiet, thoughtful shepherd, right? He had some pretty impressive action hero moments too.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the story of David and Goliath, come on, that's one of the most famous stories ever.
Yeah.
It's all about faith overcoming fear. Imagine it. This young shepherd boy facing off against this giant Philistine warrior armed with nothing but a sling and a few stones.
I've always wondered, how big was Goliath anyway? Like, really?
Well, he was over 9 feet tall.
Yeah.
And his armor weighed more than most men. He was a terrifying opponent, to say the least. But David, his faith in God, it gave him the courage to face him.
Talk about David versus Goliath, right? And it's a metaphor that still resonates today. And I bet that victory, it solidified his reputation as a warrior, but it also, you know, really strengthened his trust in God.
It did. And that's when he really started to rise to prominence. Set the stage for him becoming king, you know. But even a man after God's own heart, he's not perfect. David, he made some serious mistakes, like his affair with Bathsheba, and then trying to cover it up.
Yeah, that's a pretty dark chapter. He even had her husband killed, you know, to hide his sin.
Awful. Just a terrible thing to do. But what's important is how he reacted when he was called out. He didn't make excuses or anything like that. Instead, he showed real remorse. And he repented.
And his repentance wasn't just like, you know, going through the motions. It seems like it was a real turning point for him. What shows us that?
Psalm 51.
Yeah.
It's raw, it's vulnerable. It's David pouring out his sorrow and begging for God's forgiveness. He wasn't just trying to avoid getting punished. He wanted to fix his relationship with God, you know.
Yeah. It's a good reminder that even when we mess up, we can always turn back to God and find grace and forgiveness. David's life shows us that faith isn't about being perfect. It's about being humble, seeking guidance, and always coming back to that source of goodness, even when we stray.
Exactly. It's a very human story, and a relatable one.
So after 40 years as king, he's getting up there in years. Did he just hand the kingdom over to Solomon, his son, or was there more to it than that?
Well, you know, as he was getting ready to pass the throne to Solomon, he gave him some parting advice. Told him how important it was to obey God's laws and to really embrace God's will. You know,
I get that was a powerful moment between a father and son.
It was like passing the torch, and not just of leadership, but a faith and commitment too. He emphasized that real success, it doesn't come from chasing power or anything like that. It comes from aligning yourself with God's plan. He knew that his legacy wouldn't be about what he accomplished, but about the spiritual health of his son and his nation.
So David's last act as king was to make sure his son was ready to carry on that spiritual legacy. What an amazing example of leadership and faith. And speaking of Solomon, I mean, he's known for his wisdom, right? And he's the one who built that famous temple in Jerusalem, didn't he?
He did. Solomon's reign was a time of peace and prosperity, unlike anything Israel had ever seen. He was known for his wisdom, his wealth, and all those incredible building projects. Yeah. But his story is also a cautionary tale, because even with all those advantages, he still faced his own challenges.
Okay, this is getting really interesting. I'm I'm curious to see how Solomon stacks up against his dad, Solomon, the wise king, son of the legendary David. He definitely had some big shoes to fill. What was it about him, though, that made him so famous for his wisdom?
Well, early on in his reign, Solomon, he had this dream. And in the dream, God appeared to him and offered to grant him like any wish he wanted.
Whoa, divine dream offer. I bet most people, I mean, if I got that offer, I'd probably go straight for like power or riches, right?
Yeah.
What did Solomon ask for?
Well, Solomon, he asked for wisdom to govern God's people fairly and wisely. And God, he was really pleased with that request. So he gave him the wisdom, but he also gave him like a ton of riches and honor too.
So he got the wisdom in the bonus package, huh? What did he do with all that wisdom, though? Did his reign like live up to all the hype?
It did. His wisdom, I mean, it was legendary. People would come from all over just to hear his judgments and get his advice. He wrote a lot of proverbs and songs too. And his reign was a time of peace and prosperity. He expanded Israel's territory, established trade routes, made alliances. It really was a golden age.
Sounds pretty idyllic, actually. Peaceful kingdom, booming economy, wise and just king. But you mentioned earlier that things took a bit of a darker turn later on, right? What happened?
Well, Solomon's story, it's kind of a cautionary tale about how seductive power can be and the dangers of straying from what you believe in. You see, even though he started out so humble, it seems like as his wealth and power grew, his heart, well, it started to drift away from God.
Interesting. It really does seem like power can corrupt, doesn't it? How did that show up in his life?
Well, remember those instructions in Deuteronomy about kings not accumulating too much wealth, horses, wives.
Huh?
Yeah, well, it seems like Solomon kind of forgot about those. He ended up with a massive fortune, built this huge army, complete with chariots and horses, and he had like hundreds of wives and concubines. He fell into those very traps that God had warned about.
Now, some scholars argue that, his marriages, they were mostly about, strategy, forming alliances to keep the peace, not just like personal indulgence. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. I mean, back then it was pretty common to use marriage to solidify treaties. But even if there were political reasons, the sheer number of wives, it does suggest that he went a little overboard, And those relationships, they seem to have had a pretty big impact on his faith.
How so?
Well, according to the text, his foreign wives, they introduced him to their gods, and he started building temples for them, and even participating in their rituals. He was definitely straying from his covenant with God.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it? The very things that God warned him about, wealth and wives, they're what ultimately led him astray. He had so much promise, but in the end, it seems like worldly temptations got the best of him.
Yeah. It just goes to show that even with all the wisdom in the world, we're all susceptible to those temptations, power, wealth, pleasure. Those things aren't necessarily bad in themselves, but when they become our main focus, they can lead us down the wrong path.
And what about the kingdom? How did all of this affect, the nation as a whole?
The consequences were pretty severe. God's favor shifted, and after Solomon died, the kingdom was divided. All those seeds of disunity and conflict that had been sown, they eventually led to the end of that golden age.
So we've looked at the lives of these three kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. They each had their own strengths and weaknesses, their triumphs and their failures. What would you say is the biggest takeaway from their stories?
Well, I think a big theme that runs through all of their stories is the importance of being truly devoted to God, wholeheartedly. Saul's pride and disobedience, that's what led to his downfall. And Solomon, even though he started out so wise, he was ultimately swayed by those worldly temptations. It seems like the state of their hearts, their intentions, their motivations, those things played a huge role in their successes and failures.
And David, even with all his flaws, he stands out as someone who really tried to follow God's guidance and always sought his forgiveness. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about trying to align his heart with God's will.
Exactly. It's a reminder that we're all human,
Yeah.
We're all capable of doing great things, but we're also capable of messing up big time. It's about striving for that connection with something bigger than ourselves, even when we're not perfect. It's about seeking wisdom, being humble, and staying committed to what really matters.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive. What stands out to you as the most important lesson from these kings' lives?
Well, their stories, they're not just ancient history, They reflect the struggles that we all face. the temptation of power, the desire for wealth and control. Those things they're timeless. It's a good reminder to take a look at our own hearts, our own motivations. What are we chasing after? And is it leading us towards what truly matters?
That's a powerful question. Thank you for joining us on this journey. I hope you'll all take some time to think about these stories. What parts resonated with you? What challenges do you see reflected in your own life?
Keep searching, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.
Couldn't have said it better myself. See you all next time.